Hello and welcome. Here on the island it's absolutely chucking it down today, so myself and the parrots are taking refuge in Dave the Cave. The change in the weather is a little ironic because today Mark will be talking about how major events such as climate change affect his investments. So please stay tuned for this, episode 25 of the Desert Island Investor. Yes, I know you're wet, and no, I haven't got a towel. This episode of the podcast is generously hosted by Progressive Equity Research. Visit their website at progressive-research.com. Okay, to set the backdrop for this episode, Mark has often said that he does not focus too much on macroeconomics, but I'm certain that there must be some macro considerations in his investment decisions. Anyway, I challenged him to select a company from his portfolio that is influenced by the larger picture, so to speak, and he has suggested Genuit plc, ticker symbol GEN. Now, Genuit develops and produces what they describe as sustainable solutions for the key challenges faced in water, climate, and ventilation management within the construction industry. So let's see what Mark has to say about them. Good afternoon, Mark.
Yes, good afternoon to you, Paul.
Now, this business is closely linked to the house building sector, which is heavily cyclical. What was your wider thought process in adding this business to your portfolio?
Well, when we talk about macro, we're generally referring to broad economic data, employment rates, inflation, levels of spending, savings. Are we about to enter a recession? Are we entering a bull market? And I find that a lot of investors pore over this. They're dissecting it, doing it to death. And then my question always is, okay, how do we make money? With some investors, it's analysis paralysis. As I'm always fully invested, I save a lot of energy not trying to predict timing, when to get in and when to get out. And after all that effort, probably getting it terribly wrong. Now, one macro factor I do look at, though, is demographics. Aging populations, growing and declining populations. We've mentioned Japan previously, an increasing consumer class in emerging economies, and an increasingly mobile and migrational population around the globe. Now, this demographic argument is one I've pursued with my largest holding, me, in which I have the belief that as populations mature and contract in number, that will require more automation and vending solutions. And with Tesco, where despite what you might consider to be a mature business, with a growing UK population, that means that there'll be more bellies to fill. I've said previously that I look for some form of tailwind with my investments, and it's easier to be successful with a business that's in a sector that has a tailwind rather than a headwind, regardless of how strong a product they have or the skill of the management. With Genuit, the reasons are twofold. Climate change and the provisions that house builders and householders would have to make, and the rapidly expanding or exploding UK population that's mainly fueled by migration.
So what is the history of your holding?
I've made just one purchase, which was back in May 2018 at £3.85, and this is when the business was known as PolyPipe, and that may be a more familiar name to many. You may have seen their blue lorries with the PolyPipe in white lettering, and I think it succinctly describes what it once did. In 2021, it changed its name to Genuit, and according to the company secretary, the Genuit name reflects two of the key themes that have been consistent across the group's business for many years. Ingenuity reflects a strong tradition of innovation within our companies and the problem-solving attitudes of our colleagues, and genuine reflects the authenticity and integrity which underpins the interactions between colleagues and colleagues and their customers and other stakeholders. Together, we create sustainable living.
Right. As per usual, the base numbers, please.
It has a market cap of 1.2 billion, P of 19.2, a yield of 2.6, and that's based on the current share price of £4.85.
Now, that's a compound annual growth rate of 3.9%, and you've had some dividends along the way on top, so that's quite respectable, but it's not exactly stellar. You mentioned that the business has changed its original name, so can you provide some history of the business?
Yeah, it was founded back in 1980 as a manufacturer of extruded and moulded plastics, as that name PolyPipe suggests, and it was fully listed in 1986. It was then acquired by IMI in 1999, and they had an MBO in 2005, and it was listed again in 2014. So I had a good chance to look at it and look it over before jumping on board in 2018. And, over that period, they've conducted a number of acquisitions. And as you can see from their offering, they have their tentacles across many aspects of the average new house with regards to how the water, the climate and the ventilation is managed.
All right. Well, we will dig a little deeper into those sectors later. But you mentioned ventilation, which is precisely the area that Titan Holdings are involved in. And you are also a shareholder in Titan. So is this not a case of duplication in your holding? And if it is, perhaps you could expand a little on how it affects the diversification of your portfolio.
Yeah, you're right. Both are involved in ventilation, but Genuit have a much broader offering, being something of a one-stop shop. I concede that there is definite overlap. And I did think that the tailwind of the new building regulations on ventilation a couple of years ago would be like a rising tide and lift all boats. Now, up to this point, Titan have been unable to take advantage of this. And looking at the two businesses as a collective, I'm clearly in negative equity, despite Genuit's modest gain. Now, I maintain that I anticipate that there will be increased emphasis on ventilation and there are associated health benefits. And we recently had major coverage on the news that even a Labour MP, Jazz Athwell, had rental properties containing black mould. On the broader point of diversification, there are many considerations. Holding a further business can give you obvious diversifications, but if that business may face the same challenges, say if you own Tesco and then bought Sainsbury's, or you own Shell and then buy BP. But there are other considerations. You could feel well diversified having holdings in a cinema group, a pub chain, and a clothes retailer. But come an economic crunch, and they all feel the squeeze at the same time, and they fall under that umbrella of discretionary spending. They're the first things that people decide to cut back on. You may have a lot of exposure across your portfolio to a certain currency, typically the strength of the dollar against the pound, or even an assortment of holdings across different sectors, but in a single country. That becomes problematic, and Russia is a classic example. And then you may be balancing your exposure to growth and income, blue chips and small caps between London, LSE and AIM, and trying to make considerations for IHT, but not betting the ranch on that, because if the relief is withdrawn, the AIM market could tank. So you're constantly trying to hedge and mitigate against future potential or possible eventualities, and building a balanced portfolio is a task that demands a lot of consideration. It's probably a bit like selecting guests to a dinner party, and where do you sit them?
Okay. So shall we drill down into the different business units?
Yes, for the purpose of this exercise, I'm referring back to the annual report for the year ended 31st of December 2024. Now, there have been interim results for the 30th of June, and the picture is, as you would expect, slightly different. But for the detail on the business, I'm using the annual report, which should always be your first port of call, followed by the company website and not some 2-paragraph tip sheet. So we've climate management solutions that they describe as the need for healthier and low carbon heating and cooling. And this had a revenue of 165.9 million and an operating margin of 13.7%. Then they have the water management solutions side, which is driving climate adaptation and resilience through integrated surface and draining solutions. Revenue was 170.4 million and an operating margin of 10.4%. And then there was sustainable building solutions, providing a range of solutions to reduce the carbon content of the built environment. That had a revenue and operating margin for this division was 242.8 million and 21.9%. So those descriptions are typical business speak from the report. So what do they do? Well, within the climate management solutions, they have a brand called AD, and they do magnetite filters and water treatment products. New Heat, which do underfloor heating and heat pumps. And there's New Air and Domus. They are heating and cooling homes using fresh air with mechanical ventilation heat recovery products. So that's the Titan territory. And then there's the water management solutions, where it says our colleagues are focused on upgrading the storm water and wastewater infrastructure to adapt to the increasingly challenging results of climate change. As climate warms, the air is capable of holding more water, and this creates more frequent bouts of extreme rainfall, amounts of rain for which much of our aging infrastructure was not designed. In parallel with this, the so-called concretisation of our urban areas accelerating runoff rates. And so our green urbanisation strategy addresses those twin needs of providing stormwater resilience along with enhanced urban living solutions. Now, we'll be focusing on that a little bit later on. And then there's this sustainable building solutions, which is for the residential plumbing and drainage, prefabricated commercial soil stacks, and the range of GRS radiator pipe.
I think I can see why you see how those two tailwinds that you mentioned would benefit the business, but would you like to expand your thought process on that?
Well, if we take climate change, I'm not a denier, but I would say that the climate has always been changing. The Earth was once a molten mass, and we've had an ice age. But I would say that I'm in the same camp as the late Nigel Lawson, in that the impact on humans of adapting to the change will be far less destructive to us than chasing the total decarbonisation of how we live. And from a personal perspective, I think a lot of our problems are through the sheer number of human beings on this planet. And if we look at the birth rates, these are collapsing in nearly all countries. And we are projected to reach peak human in 2050. And the number of people the planet has to sustain in centuries to come may be far less. Now, of course, there's nothing to say that trend may reverse. There's no guarantee, but I think we have to work with the direction of travel. Now, I would say that the importance of decarbonisation is more of a focus for politicians and the media than your average Joe, including myself. Now, politicians rarely miss a good excuse to implement a tax rise. Most people are all consumed by their everyday life, and they don't welcome increased costs and disruption to their liberties. Now, this is a business that is helping us adapt to this change. Now, I may be right or wrong on the emphasis that we're putting into this, especially the size of the UK compared to rapidly carbonising countries like China. But I think, is this not all just a futile gesture? Sometimes we're right, and we don't reap the benefits. Now, many times I've been forced to demonstrate to a line manager that in fact, he's wrong and I'm right, and that's often backfired. And I know that is something that you've got experience of. Now, if a car's hurtling down the road and I step onto the zebra and I'm ploughed down, knowing I was right was of little comfort. So, any thoughts on this area, Paul? And just be careful how you tread.
Well, a lot of focus is placed on the claim that that climate change has been and still is influenced by human activities. And scientists have evidence that the two things are connected, but they obviously have no evidence that changing our behaviour will actually stop things from changing. I've had a very brief look at the issue, and I couldn't find any real scientists making predictions about what will happen, even if we partially decarbonise our way of life. So I guess at the end of the day, the choices are you either try cutting CO2 emissions as much as possible and see what happens, or you do nothing. Given those choices, I think it's better to reduce emissions and see what happens. But given the uncertainty of the outcome, I think it would be foolish to sacrifice your economy and plunge the country into debt and cold and dark in the process. Now, UK population growth and migration. Brave man for discussing that. So do you want to elaborate on your views?
Yeah, I'll try and restrict myself to what we can agree is factual. So the UK in recent years has experienced unprecedented population growth. Now, the population is higher than ever, And the driver behind that is not birth rates of existing UK citizens. Now, that stands at 1.49 births per woman. That was in 2022. And we need a birth rate of 2.1 to maintain a population at its current size. Now, the growth is coming from migration, which is both legal and illegal. Now, when this whole subject of population and sustainability is raised, there seems to be an effort to choke this off at death. And what's thrown about is, when people are talking about immigration being a problem, what they're really saying is that they don't like people with a different skin colour, or they're different to them. So it's little wonder that people are tentative to raise the issue. So according to the ONS, net migration to the UK last year was 685,000, right? Now that's actually down from the previous year, 2022, when net migration was 764,000. Now, there's a technical word for that many people, Paul. It's called a lot, right?
Yes.
Now, at the same time, despite the birth rate declining, which I mentioned, we're still getting more births than deaths. And from the ONS figures for 2021, we had 695,685 births and 666,659 deaths. So we've still got more babies than people, making way. So as of August 30, 2024, we had 9.4 million people aged 16-64 in the UK who were what they describe as economically inactive, which is an inactivity rate of 22.2%. And this was an increase of around 350,000 people from the previous year. Now, these are predominantly students, long-term sick. So we need our NHS turning people around quicker, or indeed finding out if all these people aren't genuinely sick. And on this about economic inactivity, this is why I have to put my hand up, Paul, and admit that, I'm financially independent and I don't take any benefits, but I am able-bodied, and but I'm not plugging a skill gap, and at the same time not generating any income tax or national insurance for HMRC. There again, I actually see managing my portfolio as my job. So we have this aging population and jobs up for grabs. So we invite people from other countries to fill these. But each person who comes over is not a total net contributor. They themselves need access to the NHS, a dentist, a school place for their children, and yes, a house. And this means further skill shortages. So we draw yet more people in. And I think it's like a snowball. It's a Ponzi scheme, if you will. And to use that word, it's clearly unsustainable. And I think we're obsessed with GDP instead of GDP per capita. Yes, we're making the cake bigger, but we're having to slice it into more pieces. So perhaps instead of this obsession of filling every job vacancy there is, we should perhaps bottom trim the least valuable. Surely, if you have provided full employment for your existing population, that will be what you would think to be a panacea. And at that point, I'll pause to ask if the phone lines are lighting up like a Christmas tree.
Yes, we have Keir on line 1. Shall I put him through?
No, you can tell him I'm at the opticians. So, on a lesser in number, but let's still go there. We've got tens of thousands who are on top of the people who come here illegally. People who come through illegal migration, mainly through the much publicised small boats across the Channel. Now, the terms of engagement appear to be that if somebody leaves a country where they're subject to or they fear persecution, they enter Europe through its most porous border. There's little impediment within Europe, with no internal borders and free movement, in preventing them from finally arriving at or near Calais. And they've assessed the options as they pass through each country, conducting what you could call asylum shopping, nicer, until you pay the smuggling gang your fee for a place on a dinghy, and you reach your country of choice, the UK. And this is where you then lodge your asylum claim. And if you successfully convince the authorities of your case, despite travelling through those numerous safe countries, you're guaranteed leave to remain. And there's no ceiling. There's no cap to this number. It's infinite. And there are literally tens of millions of people who like to live here. And if they could somehow have the means to reach our shores, they qualify to remain. So there have been tragic deaths in the Channel this year, which 45 45 people, Paul. Let's not forget those. And I would suggest they could have been prevented if Monsieur Macron had agreed a returns policy, but he doesn't want to do that. And I think it would have stopped these deaths, these unnecessary deaths, overnight. But it's not come into place. I don't think this is likely to stop, and it's a perilous journey. But those paying their fare are prepared, on balance, to take those risks for what they see as the rewards in reaching the UK, other than remaining in France. I mean, sadly, there are some deaths. I think 4 or 5 recently, and the very next day we had 801 people arrive. So you can see just how strong a pull factor there is. So that's your tailwind, Paul. It's an increasing population that will just need more housing, but also all the other support that goes with it, more schools, hospitals, etc. And, the commercial aspects, and we'll even need more fulfillment centres for other online shopping, more infrastructure. Whatever we have, we'll just need more. And I don't see an appetite within mainstream politicians to meaningfully reduce this. Now, I don't like what's happening. I think it's stoking up greater problems for the future. And to use that word in its truest sense, it's unsustainable. But as an investor, all I can do is accept the playing field that I'm presented with before that playing field is built on, of course. So,
bringing this back to Genuit, you can see them being a beneficiary of new house builds and, to a lesser extent, commercial properties.
Yes, the government have a target of 1.5 million new houses over the next 5 years and call this the most acute housing crisis in living memory. Now, I agree. Now we've got to get a move on. That target is 300,000 a year. We managed around 234,400 last year. Otherwise, Paul, we cannot build enough new homes, in order to release more capacity. Something may be done to the tax system, like the bedroom tax, for the likes of you and I to move into smaller homes and make way for bigger families. The average household has 2.2 residents. Perhaps we need this to increase. But all these new buildings, homes and commercial, will need to be equipped with the types of products that Genuit provide throughout. And on top of that, they also produce products for outside of buildings, sewer systems, pipes for cable protection, but also do, importantly, surface and below ground water drainage systems. They do an interesting product called Permavoid, which to the layman like myself looks like a series of plastic milk bottle crates that are sunk below the surface and can hold vast quantities of water and then be released at a measured rate. With the increasing extremes in weather and thinking of the rainfall, which we know a lot about here in Lancashire, Paul, and following the summer, I think I've started developing a webbing between my toes. We need to effectively drain that water away from our buildings. And, in this respect, I think that house building is a little like oil and gas. Many of the best sites have been used up. We've taken the low-hanging fruit, and what we're left with are often less desirable or dangerous places to build properties and reconsider sites that we previously dismissed due to potential flooding. Such is our need. Now, in that event, effective drainage systems will be paramount, more important than ever. And I can give you a related example. In Darwin, where I live, there's a new estate called Miners Gate, and they built 353 new homes on the site of the old Ellison Fold Colliery. Now, my old school pal, Paul Hawthornthwaite, who's 3 days older than me, and he looks it, we were both in Bull Hill Maternity Hospital together. He lives in what was one of just the 2 properties on that land. They were old mine owners' houses. And he's lived there for over 20 years. And he says that every couple of years, the surveyors would turn up with their theodolites and assess the land. And it was never thought suitable for building, but perhaps, it became a case, a matter of needs must. And now there are different estimates, and it is thought that there are perhaps 20 or 30 unmapped main shafts and ventilating shafts on that land. Now, they did locate a couple during construction. Indeed, Paul told me when they were developing the site, a large hole appeared in the footpath 50 yards from his house, where people walk their dogs, and Paul dropped a stone and he never heard it land. And not knowing what better to do, he contacted the police. So, and going back around 45 years ago, I had another schoolmate, Malcolm Ainsworth. I don't know what Malcolm's doing now, but I remember Malcolm, nice lad. And he lived on Marsh House Lane, which is adjacent to this land. And he left his school one morning to go to school, and there was an enormous hole in the driveway. So, this is a real problem. Now, this isn't flooding, but hopefully you can understand my wider point. I suppose, if anything, for these properties, they may be impervious to flooding, as the water may just run down the disused mine shafts. But I did send you an article, Paul, about the insurer Aviva, and they stated that 1 in 13 homes in the last decade have been built in flood zones.
Yes, that was very interesting. That according to Aviva, that 1 in 13 means that almost 110,000 new homes in the last decade have been built in a flood zone. Now, I did some digging into this because of this episode of the podcast, and in just an hour or so, I found 6 news articles where applications to build new homes were being objected to on the grounds of negative flood risk assessments. And I'll include links to those articles in the show notes, so you don't think I'm just making it up. And I particularly recommend watching the YouTube video link because it illustrates very dramatically how serious it can be when flood management goes wrong. It's quite frightening to watch. So, I mean, based on what you're talking about, the government's plans, I mean, it does beg the question: is our new Labour government's Get Britain building scheme going to result in a rush of unscrupulous builders knocking up blocks of flats anywhere they like, regardless of the suitability of the land? Suitability of the land has clearly been a pretty low priority, according to those news articles and what you've just talked about.
Yeah, I've seen that video as well, Paul, and it's well worth looking at. It's only a brief one, and I think it shows the potential problem. Now, again, where the natural environment could help us, we're increasingly covering over the land with concrete and tarmac. And again, if you go back to the price of houses, this is often prohibitive to children leaving the family home and with multiple adults in a house. And very often it's not just a 1 or 2 car family, but 3 or 4 or more. And as parking is restricted, front gardens, a natural ally of drainage are being converted into a parking space. And I know that's something that you've commented on, Paul, in the past near yourself.
Yes, yeah, it's becoming a problem. And where I live, many of the houses are built on roads which are on an incline, some more steep than others. In recent years, it's become common that if a large family moves into a house at the top of the road, the first thing they do is tear up the lawn, block pave the whole of the frontage and put 3 or 4 cars on it. So when it rains, the water that would have at least been partially absorbed by the grass now just runs off onto the driveway of the next house down. So if the owners of that house also block pave their driveway, their downstream neighbour gets the overspill from both houses. Now, if they once had a nice garden with bushes and flowers, it's pretty quickly turned into a swamp. And we do have, the property is a leasehold in the majority, and the lease does have covenants that restrict certain modifications to the properties, but I don't think they actually had any restrictions on what you did to the front of the property. And anyway, what a lot of these people do is just buy the lease, and then they can basically do what they want.
Mm. Well, I think it's relevant what we're talking about because actually on the news there's been 30 flood warnings, Paul. So I did notice that an ex-colleague of yours and a supporter of the podcast, Chris Power, on LinkedIn, he was advertising his company's sandbags as a solution for flood events. So they have a role to play, but I would argue that better storm management in the first place would be more advantageous.
Yeah, Chris, he now works for a company called Weir and Carmichael. And they sell, among other things, sandbags. So I'll include a link to their website in the show notes. Perhaps I could earn a few bob doing a leaflet drop advertising his sandbags for my flood risk neighbours. Now, you always read the annual report, and you've described this one as a hard-going document.
Yeah, very much so. It's 208 pages. Just as a comparison, MP Evans, who I'm also a shareholder in, has got it, that's just 108. So that's just a start, but that's not in itself. Almost every page is what I would describe as very busy. Now, understandably, there's a lot to cover. They've 3 separate divisions, and within them a vast assortment of product offerings. But it's though they're presenting to themselves instead of trying to communicate with the shareholder, who may or may not have a firm industry grasp on the particular product that they're describing. And in my opinion, it's overly verbose, it's repetitive, it's filled with business speak, value stream mapping, that was one, and acronyms. I think they could just do with somebody to run it past. You get somebody off the shop floor and said, is it clear what we're trying to say before we go to press? And it doesn't flow like some others, and it's disjointed. And another major factor is given the solution that they offer, so sustainable living, the environment, and the carbon, they themselves have to show that they too internally are bought into this. And we have page after page and reference after reference, like of the carbon intensity, electricity source from renewables, which is 91%, use of recycled polymers, 49.2%. But it's not just confined to a single section. And the level of detail that they go into, I found it really turgid. And I would have liked this to have been confined to a specific area instead of, again, dripping it in. Well, I'm trying to find what I call the meat. For example, on page 14, they have a picture of some empty plastic milk bottles going into bin, and this is for their wash and squash community engagement. And this is where school children wash and squash their milk bottles and PolyPipe collect these and recycle into product. Great. We have another picture of milk bottles again going into a bin on page 40, and another picture again on 49. Yeah, I get it. I'm not sure how efficient a means of collecting it is from individual schools. Instead of just going and collecting en masse from the local council collection centre, I would have thought that would have been far more efficient.
Do you still get free milk at school now?
I'm not sure, Paul. It's a bit since I was there, to be honest.
Yeah, we used to get it in a glass bottle with a foil cap on it. It was, and an inch of cream. It was horrible.
Happy days, happy days. And then all that environmental spills into the wider ESG with the lots of philosophy and culture thrown into, with gender and racial splits, diversity, inclusion, celebrating International Women's Day, LGBTQ plus, and training for all staff, and celebrating things like Movember.
So I know you have very little interest in employee categorisation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the best example I can give is when I was crippled with a prolapsed disc many years ago, and the head of the operation was introduced to my neurosurgeon, Mr. Guru, saying, now I led their pump full of tramadol. And he explained that the operation should be a success, but he did add that there were chances that it may not remove the pain. There was a chance I could end up in more pain. There was a chance I could end up incontinent. There was a chance I could end up paralysed. And as I was having a general anaesthetic, there was a chance I could end up dead. So, my thoughts at that very moment were not about his colour or his race or his religion or his sex or his sexual orientation. The only thing that was important to me was, had they appointed the very best person for the job? Full stop. It goes on in the report. We will create an environment which is engaging and where everyone is comfortable to bring their whole self to work. And it goes on and on. I don't know, you live part of yourself at home. But I really don't want to turn this into I don't really want the depth that they're trying to communicate this. And I'm not going to turn into a talking annual report, but perhaps you may want to put a link to it on the podcast. Just have a glance at it and tell us what you think. Now, I had nearly given up by the time I'd reached page 117, which is where the remuneration is, or perhaps that's precisely the idea.
Now, I believe you did query remuneration at a presentation back in 2020 when the company was called PolyPipe.
Yeah, this dates back to COVID, Paul, and the backstory was that most businesses had a very torrid time, but there were a few exceptions, the supermarkets being one of them. And they were one of the businesses operating at near normal, and people frequented in the absence of others. Yes, you could still buy your food as normal, but also alcohol instead of the pub, and that finest range instead of the restaurant, and that gift card instead of going to the card factory. They had a bumper payment, bumper COVID. Now, there was pressure in the press, and Tesco, in which I'm an investor, voluntarily decided to repay £585 million of business relief. Now, as a shareholder, I did raise an eyebrow. Why did they do this if it wasn't compulsory? But at least they had experienced a good COVID. Now, that started a domino effect, and other supermarkets and other businesses handed back the relief. None, I don't think, wanted to have the embarrassment of not having done the right thing. And at the interims in 2020, Genuit announced that they said that we have manufactured visors and distributed them and other surplus PPE into local NHS and care homes, supported by the Nightingale programme and other repurposing of NHS facilities for care and recovery, and contributed to many other local initiatives that have made a difference. So I would have thought, yes, surely we've done our bit for the cause there. These aren't products that they primarily manufacture, but they've adapted their manufacturing techniques. So, but our board decided differently. They decided to repay £700,000 of job retention scheme money in respect of 104 employees who've been made redundant, only half of which were voluntary. And they will not be also participating in the forthcoming job retention bonus scheme. Now, the company have recently gone back to the market for a £120 million equity raise to help bolster the business. They cancelled the previous final and the interim dividend. There was no payments for the shareholders. That'd be cancelled. But they did, at the same time, advise that where they'd taken a 20% cut in their salary and their package, they will be going back onto normal. So, the board held an analyst and investor presentation following this release, and there were questions from Jefferies, Peel Hunt, Deutsche Bank, and Numis, with some friendlies. Can you just add a little bit of colour too? That's the stock question. And then up at the very end, popped Mark Atkinson. Now, I was probably the only one who had any direct skin in the game, and I asked diplomatically if it had been a difficult decision to give that money back, while at the same time making those redundancies, doing an equity raise, cancelling the dividend to us, and then at the same time, the directors returning to full pay. Now, when I asked that, was it a difficult decision? What I really wanted to ask was, what do you think you're doing? So the reply was that they had to make a lot of tough decisions, and I would suggest that going back onto full pay was the least tough of the lot, and that they had to consider all stakeholders. And within stakeholders, I would suspect that shareholders were bottom of the pile. So I have to say, Paul, that following this, I certainly did cool towards the business. And I'm not saying this is I'm not saying it's the reason that I've not added, but, it's been a contributing factor. It was 4 years ago and we have a newer CEO, but it still lingers in their memory. Now, there are 1,000 of different companies that want my capital, so I'm not without options. Now, you've listened to that recording, Paul. I've not got a monopoly on being right. Permissions to speak freely. What did you think?
Yes, I agree. I remember the answer from the board featured the phrase, we had to make some difficult decisions quite a lot, which is a kind of pretty stock marketing department reply. And I've been hearing that quite a lot on TV recently. I mean, making decisions that benefit you are quite easy decisions to make, really. The difficulty is experienced by the people that your decisions affect.
Yeah, it's generally tough decisions for other people, isn't it? That impact other people. I mean, let's remember, what is priority one? And priority one is a return on your investment. Now, if you remember the film Alien, Ripley gains access to the onboard computer, Mother, and the priority one comes up on the screen, and it says that the company, their priority one is to ensure return of organism for an analysis. All other considerations secondary, crew expendable. Now, I'm not as cold and callous as that, but sometimes boards are cavalier and devil may care. And they're good at spending other people's money, which, let's remember, that's our money, the shareholders. And if you look at another movie, Wall Street, starring Michael Douglas as Gordon Gekko, and let's remember Gekko is a villain and he's not a hero, but he makes a speech at the shareholder meeting of Teldar Paper. And it's better known as the greed is good speech. And it's only fiction, but there are a lot of truisms in that speech. He talks about accountability to the stockholders, flabby management having little or no stake in the company whilst enjoying big salaries and perks. And he points out to the shareholders, he reminds them that they're the ones who actually own the company. Now, I don't see myself as a pound shop, Gordon Gekko. But I like reminding shareholders who actually owns the business, and it's the board that are accountable to them.
I understand that this is a very UK-focused business.
Yes, around 90%, but they have business in the Middle East and North America. And if you think about water being an increasingly valuable resource, I think humans have always had a strong reliance on it, then you can see why having efficient water management is important. And over the years, Paul, we've had torrential rain followed by a few weeks of fine weather, and then there's a water shortage. Now, what's been the call to action? Has it been repair leaky pipes, or has it been a hose pipe ban and an appeal to start having showers instead of a bath and not flush the toilet? Now, according to an Ofwat article dated in November 2022, we lose a fifth of our water due to leaky pipes. And that's water that's been treated. So surely the answer is what they call that we should be looking at legacy material substitution. And in the UK, Genuit expect that the demands of Ofwat on the water companies will act as a tailwind. The water companies have had some very critical coverage lately for a number of misdemeanors, including pumping sewage into rivers.
You did mention those redundancies earlier. So how many employees do they actually have?
They've got 3,161 in the report. That was spread on 26 sites. Now, they did have 30 sites at the start of 2023, but they targeted 6 for closure, and there were 2 that came in H1 2024. Now, given the very broad range, you can see why they need so many sites, as there are so many different disciplines. And they have condensed these and claim that this hasn't come at the expense of capacity.
And at the same time as streamlining the group, they continue to be acquisitive?
Yeah, they've made a couple of acquisitions in August. Sky Garden Limited, I'll read that, is a leader in green roof technologies, providing design, supply, installation and maintenance services for green and bio-solar roofs, podium decks and green walls. Sky Garden was acquired for a cash consideration of £2.5 million. The business based in Tewkesbury, Gloucestershire, will join the Water Management Solutions business unit and will extend the group's green roof offering. It will provide an additional route to market for Genuit's Permavoid business, which it complements. And we also expect synergies with Keytech installation business. Together, these provide a full blue-green roof solution offering. This is an attractive market segment with significant future growth potential associated with increasing need for urban regreening and stormwater management. And then there's also Omni and Timoleon, and they are leaders in underfloor heating, board technologies, and providers of full UFH system design and supply services. The trade and assets of the group operating Omni and Timoleon businesses have been acquired for a cash consideration of £2.7 million. Again, you can see that their offering is everywhere around the home, Paul.
We have in this episode left it to the very end, but what about some revenue and profit numbers, Mark, please?
Yeah, we nearly forgot those, didn't we? So to give us a sense of scale of the business, revenue was £586.5 million with profit before tax of £48.4 million. And since that was the end of the year, we've had the interims, and they were £272.4 million with profit before tax of £15.3 million.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Well, a lot more than I'd anticipated when I said, can you give me some indication of how macro affects your investment choices? We'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Well, that's all for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed it. Please remember the content is for information only and it is not financial advice. If you have a question for Mark for our Question in a Bottle podcast, just complete the form on our website, thedesertislandinvestor.co.uk. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.